Hello and welcome to the Business Podcast at Imperial College Business School. I am your host, Amin, Siala, and today I have two guests with me. The conversation is going to be fascinating. So, to my right is Professor Henning Piezunka, who is an Assistant Professor of Entrepreneurship at INSEAD. He has a Ph.D. from Stanford University, and he is an accomplished researcher in the areas of crowdsourcing and competition. Thanks for coming, Henning.
Great to be here.
And then we've got Sarah Otner. Sarah Otner is a Junior Research Fellow in the Strategy and Organizational Behavior Group of the Department of Management at Imperial College Business School. She has a Ph.D. in Management from the London School of Economics and a Psychology undergrad from Harvard. Thanks for coming, Sarah.
Thank you for having me.
And the link here, which I find fascinating, is that the both of you are going to be releasing papers in the forthcoming issue of the Journal of Management Inquiry. And I guess what essentially there's a bit of a link here, which is you're both interested in the topic of competition. And for the listeners out there, generally speaking, what we've got with Sarah, you focused more on the topic of status and hierarchy in a variety of contexts.
That's right.
But also you're looking at prizes, so Nobel Prizes, film awards and the like. And then from Henning, it's again competition as well comes into it, but also crowdsourcing, which is definitely something that's been more of a buzz in recent times. So why don't we just kick off with status and hierarchy, Sarah? You know, firstly, before we even get into the academic side of things, why does that topic interest you?
So I've always had an interest in anything that can't be measured financially. And anything that motivates people that's not financial. I spent a lot of time in my training in education and teaching in kindergarten, teaching in year 7s, extracurricular teaching. And education and educational psychology is a lot about motivation and perseverance through adversity that cannot be motivated financially. And also at a policy level about the best way to spend government money to achieve these objectives. So from that background, I think I got an interest in what motivates people and keeps them motivated that's not a direct payout. And the answer in the literature from psychology, from sociology, and starting to build in economics is social status.
Social status, okay. And then, I mean, what is it exactly about this you think that's applicable? So what is the conclusion that have you reached any conclusions at all with regards to status and hierarchy? You know, is there an answer? Is this good for organizations? Because I'm aware that some companies actually try to instill this in their employees, whereby they kind of try to convince them or persuade them that actually you being in this organization and being in this company is because we're changing the world and we're doing great things. And it's a way for them to sort of actually enjoy their work over and above just the financial reward.
Well, both are important. So the research for sure has decided that no one's going to work for you and work to their very best if their financial incentives are not aligned with their goals and their own personal endeavors. Alignment with the corporate culture and overarching mission, something that people can see the direct consequences of their actions for the firm, is good for the individual and is good for the firm. But I would actually say that many companies attempt to turn away from status and turn away from hierarchy and say, oh, we are flat organizations, or we're all peers here. And I think that's an attempt to avoid some of the negative aspects of status hierarchy and competition, rather than acknowledging that humans are one of the only species that competes for prestige rather than for resources and for mates. And I think once we acknowledge that this is not going away, we can find ways to use it in organizations a bit better.
So are you for flat hierarchy, flat sort of organizations? Do you think that's the way forward?
I don't. I actually don't think that flat organizations will persist. I think having a closeness to your leadership, having a voice to speak to your leadership, a way to push back against things that you find are not fit with the culture, and carving out a space for yourself are all healthy, which flat organizations enable. Being able to knock on the CEO's door, theoretically, making an appointment to see them, it is something that's healthy for everyone involved. But I don't think that they persist informally. They might persist formally and have a very flat organogram, but I don't think they persist formally over time. We do tend towards hierarchy. In organizations, in cultures, in governments, we tend towards hierarchy. And I think the longer that we can understand that and use that and work with it better, and then instead of feeling like you're going against the grain,
So are you saying essentially that it's almost like we're lying to ourselves by creating a quote-unquote flat organization where we're all the same? I mean, I think it was a company, Zappos,
Yes.
From years back. He's actually an author, the founder of that business.
That's right.
He was the one that kind of popularized, I'm sure many have
And it does
before.
work for them,
Yeah.
for what they're trying to achieve. But the other things they've built around them to enable that. They've built their own industrial city to enable that. So they have created many different ways to make that work for them. But they are still very much in the minority. But we have to remember there's a difference between social status and prestige and power and control over resources. So there was a book this year that's come out called New Power, which takes examples from outside of organizations about social organizing and social movements and trying to explain how the way that we have control over resources in the past might not persist. So I think that is more of what you're trying to get at in terms of can we stay flat, can we stay democratic, can we stay distributed? And I would say we need to make a distinction between prestige and social status and power. Those are different. In research they're different, or they might not feel that differently. And it's true that high status and high power do go together many times. But you can't have one without the other. And I think understanding that will help mobilize each one.
So it varies from organization to organization. I think also the industry you're in probably plays a big part in whether you're able to do something like this or not.
Yes.
It's just that, in the world of startups now, what attracts the millennials, the dream for being in the world of startups is this flat concept where you can have an effect and an influence.
Oh, well, that's not going away. I think people do need to see that their work has meaning and that their input has consequences. How did what they do contribute to something that the company benefited from? But I think one thing that you would say modern working prizes that we did not have as much before is autonomy. Time and space, being able to control parts of your work and therefore parts of your output. And again, that's very different than saying we have no hierarchies here, or we have distributed power here. That's yet again something different.
Okay, so Henning, you really like this metaphor of Formula One collisions. Tell us a bit about that.
So to me, this has become more of a metaphor, right? So more than a metaphor. So what we were interested in, my co-authors and I, was the idea, when does it happen that competition actually escalates into conflict, right? What we generally like to think of competition as simply a good thing, right? We very often think like, hey, competition actually drives people to perform better, to try harder, to kind of get the best out of themselves. And the idea behind the paper that we wrote was to ask, under what kind of conditions can competition actually be detrimental? And so the way we looked at that was that we said, let's have a look at Formula One, and specifically, let's look at collisions in Formula One, right? Because we want these drivers to compete as hard as they can, but we don't want them to collide with one another, right? That's not in the initial design of that. And so what we try to understand is, what is it that lets competition escalate into conflict and results in a collision among competitors?
Yeah. So at what point is the collision bad, and why do you think that metaphor is relevant and applicable to real life?
So it's really interesting what we figured out, why these collisions happen if two actors are status ambiguous. And right, so status is this funny term academics use, right, which dominates so much, and a lot of people in the real world have a hard time relating to. But like, to put this in more casual terms, right, if somebody has status, that's kind of the person you defer to, right? So give me a very simple example. You know that a person has status if you would say like, if my phone is vibrating in my pocket right now and I'm talking to that person, I would not take that phone out. Whereas if the person does not have status, and so you're like, you don't care so much about who that person is or how much that person respects, right? You would immediately take out your phone, right? Okay. And so that kind of gives you a feeling for, hey, do you have status or don't you have status, right? If the person you're talking to constantly takes out the phone when you're talking to, right, you don't have that much status, right? So in my particular case, my wife constantly looks at her phone when she's talking to me, which gives you a feeling for the status I enjoy in that relationship. And so here's the thing, right? So we are all kind of in this kind of weird status hierarchy. How much do people actually respect one another and stuff like that? And here's the interesting phenomenon which can happen. we actually, and I very much agree with what Sarah said, you see, people are seeking kind of hierarchies. You want to understand where do you sit in the pecking order. And if you don't know where you sit in the pecking order, it becomes a very uncomfortable state of being. You're like in this constant mode where like, oh, is that person better than me? Am I worse than that person? So it's an uncomfortable space to be in, and so you try to resolve it. And so what we find that in Formula One, if two drivers actually status ambiguous, so it's unclear who of the two actually has higher status, they actually are more likely to collide with one another. And you see them, there are all kinds of reasons, right? So one reason is, you're focused on the other person, you might be somewhat aggressive, you might think of that person as a rival. Another aspect is they're just like normal rules which kind of guide our interaction in everyday life, are just not in place. So imagine the following, right? The president of Imperial College and we go kind of in the direction of the same door at the same point in time, right? So in that case, it's totally clear who defers to whom, right? Here's me, little assistant professor Henning Piezunka, right? And obviously I'm going to defer to like the great president of Imperial, right? However, imagine there are two assistant professors running to the same door. Immediately I'm thinking, why should I defer to that person, right? There's basically no rule in place. So the moment you are status ambiguous, there's much less, there's less of a chance you can coordinate easily, and so there's a much higher chance of conflict emerging.
And it's very inefficient for the system or for the organization, because one thing that status deference helps us do is make decisions in conditions of crisis or uncertainty. And you could call that a relationship between status and expertise. If you knew who was the expert, you would then defer to the expert's judgment. This person knows more, has more experience than I do. If you don't know who the expert is, or you can't be sure because of time pressure or danger, a status hierarchy and the flows of deference that way help you decide who to listen to in times of uncertainty. So there are positive benefits to having a status hierarchy and to everyone knowing what it is.
Yeah.
And to constantly dancing and reorganizing, it's very inefficient for the system, and it doesn't help for preparedness for decision making.
So what is it like in the army, generally? I mean, would you say that in the army, it's usually extremely tightly defined roles? Because I always like to refer back to the army, because in the military in general, those are the best example where you see real human ingenuity and creativity, because it's a matter of survival. And there's so many lessons to be learned from there. Would you say that in the army, because it's, sergeant, commando, etc., all this very tightly defined hierarchy? So do you think then that we can draw lessons from that part?
So that is an example of needing to make a decision in time of danger. The chain of deference is very, very clear. But one thing that certainly I know from the American context, the American military has been doing with its organizational development and change in the last, let's say, generation of recruits, is helping people to have voice, which is to be able to speak to their higher status others when they have a piece of expert knowledge, or when they have a piece of information. We call it information asymmetry. When I have a piece of information that you do not, in some contexts that can be a bargaining chip for me, or that can be advantageous for me. But in a situation where we are working together towards the same goal, that then becomes my piece of expert knowledge. And so one thing that they have been doing is trying to balance how to preserve a chain of command with how to have voice and expertise, and the fact that these days knowledge is so distributed, and they do specialize much earlier than they ever did before. So they have been taking a conscious effort in organization development to plan this into the system now.
Yeah, I feel like this ties into Henning's crowdsourcing research in a way, because this is something you focus on, right, in terms of how can you capture interesting knowledge or sort of something you can apply to an organization from a group of people. And sometimes they can be lowered down in the hierarchy, if you like, but a contribution or a suggestion they have might actually have extremely positive implications to the organization.
So you see, you're absolutely right. They can be at the bottom of the hierarchy. They might not even be part of the hierarchy at all, right? So you see, there's this famous saying, no matter which organization you work for, the smartest people, not all of the smartest people are working for you, right? No matter if you're Google, no matter if you're NASA, whoever you are, there are more smart people outside of your organization than within your organization. And what you try to do is that you look for a way basically to tap into those people's knowledge, right? You might have a particular problem, you might search for a solution for the problem. Sometimes you use for a problem which your organization could solve, right? But so the idea is really kind of to tap into the knowledge which is outside of the organization, right? A famous example of this was, think, when the BP Deepwater Horizon accident happened, right? They urgently needed to find a way how to fix the problem, and so they reached out and said, like, who can help us to solve this problem? And you got ideas they got more than 100,000 suggestions.
Wow.
Starbucks, for example, uses crowdsourcing to come up with new ideas for like different kind of offerings, for drinks, for different new types of coffees and stuff like this. And believe it or not, there are more than 40,000 suggestions for new kind of drinks that Starbucks is supposed to offer. So this gives you a little bit of a feeling, kind of how powerful crowdsourcing is. And the creativity you can tap into this. And what I've done in my work over the last few years is basically to better understand the different stages of crowdsourcing. So what is it that you need to do to A, find good ideas, B, then select ideas among those which you have gathered, and C, how do you deal with the ideas which you choose or which you do not select upon. So that's been basically my research program over the last few years.
Where's the part in that process where the good ideas get rejected?
So that goes back to, you see, the way how I kind of stumbled on rejection was a very interesting dialogue I had with David Kelly, the founder of IDEO. And IDEO is probably the leading, or relatively certain, the leading design company. So it's really like a hub full of creative ideas. And so I talked with him about what would be challenging for him in the creative process. And interestingly, his challenge was not to come up with new ideas or to select among ideas, but the key challenge for him was, how do you reject good ideas? And so here's the problem. If you think from his perspective, right, every day people like him have like 100 people coming to him with good ideas, truly good ideas. But he can only implement 1 or 2. So he needs to say no to 98 or 99 of those ideas. And so the question he had, how do I say no to these people in a way that I can ensure that they come back the next day with a new good idea? And so it turns out what managers mostly tend to do is that they're just silent. And the reason for that is that they don't want to offend anyone, right? Mm. It makes sense. Somebody comes to an idea with you. It's kind of offensive to say, like, no, I'm not interested in your idea, right? So you might just stay silent, right? Yeah. And that's an understandable reaction. Funny enough, from the other side, from the person who does not get any feedback, what the manager wants to be non-offensive, from the person who has actually submitted the idea, just looks like ignorance. Mm-hmm. It's basically like, hey, I'm not listened to, right? They do not even seem to care about my idea. I put in all this effort and submit my ideas to them, only that they now don't react to it. So the people gets really agitated and says, like, all right, I sent you one idea, you didn't even bother engaging with that, so I'm not gonna send another idea. And so what we tried to tease out in that research was to figure out, what is it that organizations can do that they can continue to engage people whose idea they did not act upon or did not select on the first attempt? And so it turns out, if you respond to the idea, even by just saying no, it actually has a positive effect. Because the funny thing about it is, you see, at first time you would think like, hey, getting a no renders you like less likely to try this another time. But actually people become more optimistic. They think like, oh, look, they're actually paying attention to my ideas. Well, it was not this one, but now I know that they actually pay attention to that, to the ideas they submit, and so they submit another one. Another thing which turned out to be extremely effective, if they respond to you using the same linguistic style. So here's what happens. Imagine I send an idea to you, and I do this like in a very particular linguistic style. So I come to you and say like, hey, bro, love your podcast. This is what you should, however, change ASAP. Okay? And you write back to me and say like, no way, dude. Peeps generally like it, got better things to do. Right? So you see, in that moment, I might actually say, hey, okay, you didn't react to my idea, but the two of us, we are so close. Right? We are really speaking the same language.
Yeah.
We are thinking about the same way of
Yeah.
things. Right? So the fact that our linguistic style matches kind of helps us to form a connection, even if the idea itself did not come to implementation. And so that is the way how you ideally reject an idea if you want to hear from that person again. The flip side is, if you don't want to hear from that person again, then you basically kind of take a page out of the book of modern dating and you just ghost the person and say like, hey, I'm just going to be silent. I don't want to hear from that individual again. So the best way to ensure that, I'm just not going to show any reaction whatsoever.
Yeah, I believe that some of the best people at rejecting are venture capitalists. Because again, just like the founder of Video, him receiving so many ideas, VCs receive a lot of pitches and many of them are good. But I think one of the reasons why they have to learn how to become very good at rejecting is because they know that who seems to be somebody that's not going to achieve anything might one day, it could be next year, it can be next week, come up with a unicorn of a business. So they have to be on edge in how they reject an idea.
And your feedback needs to separate the idea from the contributor as well. So
it's not personal.
So it's not personal. Exactly. It is judgmental, but it's not personal.
Yeah, I'm also wondering if somebody was ever to measure the level of frustration. So let's stick with the IDEO example. If I, sent in a good idea to David Kelly, as you say, and the frustration level I'd have if he did not respond to me within a month versus the frustration level I would have had he rejected me, I'm guessing, and I firmly believe, that it would be less if I just got told no. Because at least I know, right, there's a certainty that my idea wasn't picked up. So essentially I can partly put the blame onto my idea or my style of delivery as opposed to uncertainty. What do you think about that?
So the funny thing about it is what he writes in a rejection doesn't make so much of a difference. It matters much more how he writes it. So surprisingly, the content doesn't matter that much. It's somewhat counterintuitive. You see, we have studying multiple millions of ideas. We have like 2.3 million ideas, but there are of course strong boundary conditions, right? You see, if I come to you and I send like 2 sentences in how you kind of might tweak the podcast here and there a little bit, right? That's one thing. I don't put an enormous amount of effort into my suggestion, right? If I've ever kind of worked on an idea for 2 months and then send it to you, right? Even a kindly formulated rejection might then not kind of put me in a better mood about it. So, right? So you need to look carefully at the context. However, I think, you see, one thing you can generally take away from that, you want to think very, very carefully about how do you deal with the people you do not interact with immediately, right? So I really liked your venture capital example. We have actually a quote by Mark Andreessen from the venture capitalist Andreessen Horowitz in the paper, where Mark Andreessen points out our main job is to crush entrepreneurs' dreams. They get like 4,000 applications a year and they only say yes to about 20. So they need to say no to 3,980 pitches a year, and as a result you better become very, very good at it, right? How do you say no? Do you say no quickly? What kind of feedback you get? Because you see, the kind of feedback you provide affects, as Sarah pointed out, whether these people come back again, right? But it also affects your reputation within the community, right? You don't want that person to walk away and say like, listen, these guys are complete jerks, they didn't even listen, they didn't really engage with it. So
yeah, I mean, just to stress on the idea, actually, so Silicon Valley is known to have, say, an abundance of capital. The issue is not the capital, and what becomes extremely important is reputation. If a venture capitalist there in that ecosystem does one thing wrong, that could rule him out, even if he's willing to invest capital. So I think in contexts like that, that's another reason why they would need to reject gracefully. So we had a brief chat before the podcast started recording about losers there in a specific context. So Sarah, I'll let you tell us a bit about that.
So this was part of one of my 2 essays in the collection that we published this month, which is about taking the difference between modeling winners and everyone else as a loser in a very binary setup, which also models competition as a winner-take-all stake. Instead, what my research at Imperial does is look at the difference between what I call winners, near winners, which is a set of matched elite performers who don't win a high prestigious prize, who don't attract a grant, who don't gain funding, but who, other than that decision, are similar to the winners, performing at the same level or have similar qualities and comparisons.
Yeah.
And then we can also make a bright line somewhere else farther down the curve, depending on the context, that we can call certain losers, let's say.
Right.
And then, of course, there's the group that is completely understudied, which is never entered.
Never entered at all.
So they are not in a model that looks at winners and everyone else as a loser, that blurs entered but lost and never entered. It says we only care about winners and everyone else is the same. In my research, I'm teasing out those distinctions into those different categories, both within the same individual at different times in the journey, but also within the same competition, just separating individuals out.
And I guess there are many examples of near winners in a variety of contexts, right? Did you mention the film industry, is it that?
So in any context where there's a short listing, a long listing and then a short listing, you could consider a set of long list and short list candidates as near winners. So this is very, very public in some situations, like in the Academy Awards. We know who the nominees are, and that is used as a marketing tool. Just go straight on the poster from for the production distribution company. The number of nominations per film, the nominations per actor, let's say, or per role player. It could be someone in the production setup as well. Book prizes are another situation.
Yep.
So these are often many, many cultural competitions, arts prizes. But we also have science prizes. So I look at the historical data belonging to the Nobel Prize. Nobel Prize in Physics or the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, but the Nobel Prizes in general. And then you have others that are between those areas, which we can study in the innovation spaces. So grand challenges or big prizes like the Longitude Prize that's going on now for antimicrobial resistance. So that's a prize and that's a competition, and that has someone's going to win at the end. But there are many good ideas and solutions, as Henning was saying, along the way. And there are many other qualified elite performers who don't otherwise get this distinction. So there are near winners in most contexts. If there's any sort of sifting or filtering or judgment, expert judgment, then that will generate a set of near winners.
What I find interesting about that is, so a couple of years ago, I used to spend more time than I do now watching films, and I'm quite selective on which film I decide to watch, because that's going to be a good 2 hours of my day. It's going to be dedicated. It's worth doing a bit of research. And obviously, because the Oscar winners list is slightly limited, I opted in to see the shortlist, who was shortlisted to the Oscars. Because I thought, well, surely they're just as good, but they just didn't make the cut. So I do agree with you there. I think now here's a question. Is it something, how can I say, natural, native to us as humans, that we like to, discriminate between people in a binary way, where you're either a winner or a loser? But you know what I mean? Because I think, is that how we've been conditioned to look at things?
It is efficient for the brain. It is efficient to look at and attend to high status or high prestige is one of the qualities we think of for status. Prestige, esteem, admiration, and respect, to try and distinguish it from physical dominance, right?
Yeah.
So that is something we attend to, is looking for the people who have that, which was part of what I was trying to say. It's not going to go away. I would say that as some of our more basic needs are met, and as some of our work looks more similar, knowledge work, what used to be called the white-collar professions, but knowledge work looks more and more similar, that this increases. The way we need to distinguish ourselves, which might be in a hierarchy, or which might be having status or not, the desire for that increases.
The desire for that increases in which context?
Well, you can think in any context. So your favorite, the Academy Awards, a few years ago they went from a 5-film finalist list to a 10-film finalist list.
Okay.
And that was also part of their diversity and inclusion initiative, was to try and say, well, we recognize that there are more voices that we're not capturing, more players from different backgrounds, so we will expand this. So they still only have one winner, but now they went from one winner and 4 near winners to one winner and 9 near winners, which would then give you twice as many films to watch before the annual awards,
Okay.
if you're trying to catch up. So it works in that context as well.
So yeah, go ahead, Henning.
It's nothing I do research on. It pops up a lot in my teaching. But there's been fantastic research on it. You're absolutely right that in general people try to categorize things into binary categories. You're either a winner or you're a loser. Something is good or something is not good. Something is working or something is not working, right? So people tend to go towards these binary choices, and that's not that's not always in their best interest, right? Because most of the stuff is actually what you might call like contingent, right? You can't say like, hey, that's a good characteristic or that's a bad characteristic. It completely depends on your situation, right? So this is, if you think about like corporate strategy, all kinds of entrepreneurial strategies and so on, right? Very often you would say like, hey, what works, what does not work? And the true answer is, all kind of things work, but you need to understand under what kind of circumstances these work. So we say, I think that's like a major flaw, that very often people kind of try to cook things down into these like binary scales. So it's a major, I have this, for example, in my class when I have guest speakers. Like a guest speaker would say like, oh, I don't want to have a prestigious venture capitalist because they are so full of themselves or something like that. And then the next person comes in and says like, hey, you really need a prestigious venture capitalist because they help you to kind of get your name out. And of course, you see the key thing about it is it's a multidimensional problem, right?
Okay.
It's great to have a VC which has prestige for certain kind of purposes, but there are also obviously downsides on it, right? So there's fantastic work by David Shu at Wharton, which are like, hey, you pay an enormous kind of price to have a high profile venture capitalist. So you cannot say, it's not as easy to say like, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Very often we try to cook things down, but it's much kind of, you become a much better manager if you understand what about it is advantageous, what about it is harmful, and under what kind of circumstances do we want to resolve this trade-off in what way.
And the other thing is that status is always relative. So we talk about a local status and a global status.
Yeah.
But you could also say that in certain comparisons, you would be higher status than someone else, and in other comparisons, you would be lower status. So it's about a relative position in a hierarchy that matters to you in that context. It's never going to be absolute. And again, that's the difference, one main difference between status and power. Power is an absolute setup. You have control over these resources or you do not. I might have more or less than you do in a local comparison, but in general, we know where the resources go. In status, it's always relative. And I cannot have status without someone to compare me to. I cannot have status in a void. Right?
Yeah.
So this relativity and this context dependency is a part of the definition of status and competition. Right?
Yeah. It is very interesting, this concept of, us categorizing either a winner or a loser. So there's 2 examples from the early 2000s where somebody created a YouTube, an online video player, and it failed because the internet speed just wasn't quick enough, and also the devices were not good enough. It clearly succeeds now, YouTube. Same with another food delivery company. I think it was the late, maybe 99 in the .com bubble time. That I believe that's the one.
Yeah.
And now you could argue at that point, this is a complete failure. This didn't work. You're a loser. You're in the loser category. But it was just premature. Put in a premature time. So I think I do agree in the sense that we need to maybe not see things in a black and white fashion. There's always something to learn from something. And one of my favorite authors, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, the author of Black Swan and Anti-Fragile and other books, he's a big believer in acknowledging failed entrepreneurs. Because he says, just as much as the successful entrepreneurs and the good businesses have benefited society and the economy in general, well, the ones that didn't make it equally taught us something. And that's why I think with the near winners or the guys that might have raised money, they might have tried to scratch an industry, they've gotten close, but they just haven't quite nailed it. There's so much to learn from there.
Yes, and the other thing is to remember that they are only a near winner in this competition compared to this ultimate winner. They might already be bringing status and prestige from outer context. In science and innovation tournaments, they almost certainly have multiple degrees among them, multiple PhDs, experience leading. Patents is also, number of patents per person is also a metric that we can use to look at the quality of these teams or founder teams in the entrepreneurship space. So people are bringing valued characteristics and experiences with them. It's just in this context they are near winners, and that's why each of my projects again is context specific in how we study them. But as with most academic papers, we then try and pull back a level and find how that can be used. What are the implications for business, for society, and how can they use papers? So we have to go context deep into Formula One, into the Nobel Prizes, into the Academy Awards or the Emmys, to understand the mechanisms at play in that context, what that context values, and how we see that by looking at the winners and then looking at the near winners for a bit more information.
Yeah.
But we still need to take the lessons from that across context, so that Henning's lessons about Formula One collisions, for example, if you take that together with Gavin Kilduff's work on rivalry. So he talks about how you look at rivals and how rivals need each other to exist and push each other and motivate each other from sports. He uses sports rivalries as the data set, as the way to generate the knowledge. But of course he uses it in business rivalries, in brand wars as well. So there's some information about rivalry, and again about when is rivalry healthy and when does it cross that line and become detrimental to both parties.
What is the difference? Is there a strict definition difference between rivalry and competition?
So in Gavin's work, rivalry is about who you define yourself against.
Okay, so it's relative.
So for Harvard, as much as we don't like the other place, as much as we don't like Yale and the Eli's,
Okay.
Harvard is a rivalry.
Just for those of you who don't know, Harvard is a university in Boston.
Okay.
Just one.
Thank you for
one
clarifying. I'll be disappointed if someone's listening to this podcast and hasn't heard of Harvard, to be honest. But you never know.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's a rivalry. That's the two of us against each other, that has
Relatively
history,
similar
that has
status.
identity, of similar status,
Yeah.
and that we need each other in that relationship and push each other through that relationship.
Okay.
Other players join the competition for, in this case, a sports tournament, or in general, let's say, university rankings. But a rivalry is usually a pair of peers.
Yeah. So you could think of the big tech companies arguably as rivals, if they are competing, with a similar product.
Oh, you see, if they compete with a similar product, right? Then they're definitely competitors, right? Because they're actually competing for the same resource.
That's right.
What rivalry does is it goes somewhat beyond that. Beyond competing for the same kind of resource, for the same kind of competitors, I'm actually very focused on you, right? So, there are all these anecdotes that at some point Microsoft, Steve Ballmer was basically keen on destroying Google, right? So you have this emotional component in it, which might actually drive people. So Gavin Kilduff, who you mentioned, shows that rivalry drives people to kind of engage in unethical behavior. The work on Formula One, right, that you actually kind of, life-threatening behavior, right? If you actually have a collision with one another, right? This is a collision which takes place at 300 kilometers per hour, right? So this is an extremely dangerous behavior. So there's this kind of complete emotional overlay where you say, like, I'm become so focused on this particular rival.
Yeah. See, when I heard you say that, and I listened to your podcast this morning, as I mentioned, which I recommend people to listen to. It's another 20-minute podcast where you're interviewed. I thought of the example from the film Fast and Furious. I don't know if you know it, but in that film, there's a lot of where people are driving towards each other head on, as quick, and it's whoever chickens out, essentially. Yeah, whoever, and it's quite similar to see who's the person that will persist and win at the end of all this. But the question is, so do you believe in competition? Then is it a good thing?
So now I don't want to fall into the same trap where I basically say like competition is a good thing or a bad thing, right? You see, there's been fantastic work recently in market design, right? So you want to be very thoughtful about how you design competition, right? In many ways, competition is a great tool which you can leverage to get the best out of people, right? But at the same time, you also want to be careful about how you design it, because it can become incredibly destructive, right? So you see, there's been this famous example of the ice skaters, right? Where one actually sabotaged the other in the US. You say, like, the moment Mike Tyson bites into Evander Holyfield's ear, that's unhealthy competition, right? So you want to find a way that you can get the best out of competition, right? Where it really motivates people, where it pushes them to perform, but where it does not drive them over the edge, kind of attacking one another, being in conflict with one another.
Yeah.
And this point about competition design is a facet or a stream of my research. So two of the things that I look at in my research around competition design are, one is about judges. How do we choose the judging panel? What responsibilities do they have? And what mechanisms do we have for removing a judge or changing a judging panel if we find that the fit isn't there anymore, or if it's not serving?
That's very topical, Sarah.
And the other one, in terms of competition design, is what I do in innovation tournaments and looking at the different stages that funding is released. So there's two main models: a grant, which is, let's say, seed grants at the beginning, or prizes. Prizes, as we've discussed already, is an end product celebration, let's say. Anything from a final pitch project for a prototype, all the way up to a lifetime achievement award. So prizes generally are retrospective, and grants are generally prospective. You might have to bid for it, but it's all about potential. And then you're given a grant before the work is done. And actually, part of the work that I'm doing that's recently been funded by the ESRC is to look at a hybrid grant prize model, to where we give out some money in the beginning and some money at the end, and there's stage gate play in between, the steps in between, where you
milestones
can
almost.
Milestones,
Yeah.
but you can continue to compete all the way through.
Yeah.
It's not that if you lose in the beginning, you're not a certain loser. The near winners can still exist and have influence. So there are, and this is also in the special collection in Journal of Management Inquiry, which is about conscious choice in competition design. Everything is a choice. The statement of why our foundation exists, the statement of what we fund and what we don't fund. At a national policy level, for example, our innovation policy and our funding, let's say research grant funding, what's going to be funded and what's not. They list overarching priorities, grand challenges that need to be solved. And it's not to say that you won't gain any money if you don't work on that, but this is where we're driving our focus. And each of those is a conscious choice at the design stage. And this is something that we need to recognize, that all of this reflects the values of the designers or those in control at the time, and they can be changed. And they are a statement of our values. Where we put our money is where we show our values. But competition is designed by people. And I think this is something that we often forget, especially if we're railing against something that we perceive as unfair.
Yeah.
Or a misalignment between what something's stated aims are and what the prize winners, the face of it now becomes. We need to remember that these are decisions made by people, and that they are reflective of our past and also where we want the future to be. So it's about competition structure, competition design as well.
Yeah, what comes to mind now is the doping scandal from the cycling story in the past couple of years. You know, that's where people were so competitive that they were taking unethical, ways of becoming stronger. And also, actually, another thing that popped to mind is, I don't know if you've heard of something called the Cobra Effect. So that term originates from Vietnam, where they were giving people rewards and bounties for killing cobras. And obviously it worked for the short term, but then people started actually breeding these cobras in big quantities, and as a result, the solution actually became a problem.
Thomas Chabloy at HEC in Paris has actually explicit work on this, which shows that this Cobra Effect actually applies quite a bit in modern organizations. So,
really?
So it's not just anecdotal evidence in that sense, but you actually incentivize people in a wrong way, and it has side effects you did not anticipate, and the whole thing basically goes downhill from there.
Yeah, it is definitely fascinating, and I think within the modern times, I guess a lot of organizations are obviously just profit driven. You know, with regards to, there isn't that much attention devoted to what are actually the downsides of this. And again, just a simple example of how, plastics is becoming a big problem now, all that plastic going to waste. But you see these organizations that are producing products that are packaged in an unsustainable way. They're very good for traders and the markets. We love them because they generate profits and everyone's happy. And we just want to push aside any negative effect that's happening. I think, and again, because they're competing well, the side effects are pushed. It just slightly draws parallels here, really, which I think is interesting. What are your takes on? Again, this isn't recent anymore, but a couple of years back regarding the Oscars issue, I believe, regarding, about the black community raising issue with that. Is that, you think, where do you stand in that in terms of, is this a design issue, in your opinion?
Well, what it showed us and what their immediate solution was a lack of diversity in the judges.
Okay.
So whether the judges were replicating their own image, or not was something that we were attempting to measure bias in the judging. But what it showed was that the invited and elected members of the Academy were not as diverse as they might have been or as they could have been. So the immediate corrective action was to increase diversity in the membership of the judging panel. Because it's a very large panel. It's about 4,400 eligible members who can vote in each of these different categories. So there was room, and there's no structural reason they could not have increased that. It's not, let's say, 100-member sitting body, or in the work we did, the Matthew Effect, it's not talking about 40 seats in a National Academy of Sciences. There was no reason they couldn't increase the number of eligible judges, so they did.
Okay.
And the follow-on effects of that are a more diverse panel of nominees, of near winners, and we're starting to measure over time whether that has actually permanently changed the diversity of eventual winners. We know it has in the near winners, in the nominees, or even in the long list that we, the public, don't get to see. We know that, but we don't know the long-term effects of what the winners will look like, whether it's a short-term band-aid or whether it's a long-term change that we've been able to affect.
Mm-hmm.
You see, I would add. So I fully agree with what Sarah said. I would add one thing. Beyond diversifying a group of judges, I would also say you can render people who are already judges more aware of their biases. So I'll do this. I do this thing when I teach my class. I teach a case on Rent the Runway, which is an American. It's not a startup anymore. It's an established company at this point, and they rent out clothes for women. And what I do in my class is that I basically ask, what is the value proposition? And then I play a little trick on the class that I only pick on men. So a lot of people raise their hand, I only pick men. And after, I've picked 8 men and ask how the company creates value, I ask, did somebody realize? And all the women are extremely frustrated at that point because I didn't pick any of them. But the men don't see that I played the trick that I only ask men about how a startup which is only geared towards women actually creates value. So you see, so the lesson about this is, right, you see, it's not the men are immediately embarrassed by that and say hey, we should have listened to women, but they also agree, you know what, I didn't realize that only men spoke up. So most people are actually not very aware of their biases. You see, it's not that they're proud of their biases, right? Nobody kind of wakes up in the morning and says I'm gonna make a biased decision and only pick people who are exactly like me, right? Very few people have actually that aim, right? So actually educating people or simply rendering them aware and say look, this is your upbringing. That is your ethnic background. Yep. That is how you think about the world. You see, very often you see a way to deal with race or gender and all kinds of biases seems to be for people to say oh, we should be blind to this. We don't see this. And I always feel no. You shouldn't be blind to that. You should be very, very aware of that and be thoughtful about it and how you treat people. But only if you're aware of your own biases and how people perceive your treatment, you can actually work against it.
But discussing the judges again, so we need judges. we delegate this decision making to judges, the same way we were discussing about why do we defer to higher status others for decision making. But something else we know about judges is, as experts, their thinking patterns are different than the way an informed other interested party might decide. We call it expert cognition. So there's work by Kevin Boudreau and Karim Lakhani and Eva Guinan that they convinced the dean of their medical school to allow them control over the medical grants process. And what they did was very, very interesting. Instead of going only to the oncology department and say, you make the oncology grants, and to the gynecology department and saying, and you give grants in OBGYN, they decided to assume that everyone had a certain level of medical training and to qualify how much training and how much experience filing for and getting these research grants they had. And then they essentially swapped. They distributed the grant judging across different departments. And they measured the quality of the judgments that the experts made. And it turns out that within their own expert sector, so an oncologist judging the quality of an oncology proposal was quick to pick out the negatives, the reasons not to give an award, or the reasons why it was less than a perfect proposal. Whereas an expert from a cognate field in medicine judging that was more likely to give an award and give a larger award. So that tells us that we do need experts, but even experts can be trained or reused. So for example, in the Academy Awards context we're discussing, instead of dividing out the technical awards from the arts side of the awards, which are currently even given in separate sessions, you can ask expert cinematographers and lighting designers to judge acting, directing, producing, for example.
Okay, so it's a cross kind of collaboration and cross-judging.
It's a different type of diversity. What I'm saying is, when we say diversity, small d or capital D, we're not always talking about surface diversity or these ascribed characteristics. We're also talking about different patterns of thinking.
Yeah.
Right, and different ways of judging, and different, as long as we're all upholding a similar set of standards, then after that, how you apply those and how those look to you, that's your expertise.
Yeah.
And that's where we defer to you. It's not efficient for us all to be experts on all of it.
Yeah, and I was having this conversation recently, actually only a week ago, about diversity, and it's very easy for us when we hear the word diversity, as you say, is think we associate it with race or religion. But in reality, diversity can come in many other shapes and sizes. It can be two people who might be exactly the same, in the exterior, but one of them is an engineer, the other person is an artist. And they think completely differently about a situation. And them together, judging something, for example, or collaborating on a project, that will result in better things. So it's interesting, Henning, you say, so it's definitely something worth emphasizing on, and not kind of just brushing it under the carpet. There's this concept where we need to be aware of what biases we have in organizations.
You see, sometimes, so one thing we saw in this, in the work on crowdsourcing, is also that sometimes, how should I say, you create these biases almost by itself. So one thing we found, so all these organizations which engage in crowdsourcing, right, if Starbucks kind of says like, we are collecting 40,000 ideas, they try basically, how should I say, what they try to be is super creative, right? We want to have all these ideas. But what then happens is, you see, you're collecting all these ideas, but then you also need to select among all these ideas. And so you suddenly have so many ideas that you don't actually have the time to engage with every single one of those ideas. And so you bias yourself against the truly creative things, right? So if I come to you, let's say I come to you with 3 ideas in how you could improve the podcast. You're going to listen to everyone very carefully, and even if one is a little bit out there, right, you might still listen to it. But imagine I come to you with 100 ideas, and 1 or 2 are like really out there. At that point, you're like, listen, I have 100 ideas I need to kind of plot through. I have no time to kind of look into these 1 or 2 crazy ideas. So the funny thing is, you get more ideas, which is supposed to help you to be more creative, but very often generating too many ideas might actually render you less creative, because in the stage when it comes to selecting ideas, what it ends up is that you then kind of focus on this very, very narrow set. So Linus Dallanda and I, we have this paper called distant search, narrow attention, which means like, hey, I search very distantly. I look really, really broadly everywhere. But when it then comes to the selection, I'm suddenly very, very narrowly focused.
Yeah, this again reminds me of Malcolm Gladwell's example, I think, regarding, I think it's bolognese or meatballs. What he mentions is that more choice actually makes our life difficult. I don't know how much this ties in.
Oh, you see, very much. I mean, this point by Malcolm Gladwell goes back to fantastic work by Barry Schwartz, where he shows like, hey, if you give somebody too much choice, you're basically like, this decision becomes too hard. I don't know what to pick at all, right? Yeah. What Linus and I found in our work is that we say like, you know what, if you have too much choice, you basically tend to pick the stuff which comes with the least cognitive effort, but that's not necessarily the best thing.
Wow, and you recommend receiving less recommendation suggestions.
You want to be very, what you want to do is you want to anticipate, will we have enough time later on to look carefully at those ideas, right? You see, if you have enough time to carefully go through all of these ideas, the more the better, right? Sure, if you have time to carefully scan 1,000 ideas, get 1,000 ideas, that is great. If you actually only have really time to look at 100 ideas, and then you collect 1,000, what ends up happening, right? What ends up happening is that you just skim 1,000 ideas, and everything which is a little bit odd, you immediately filter out. But it's these ideas which look a little bit odd in the beginning, right, which are truly powerful, right? Think of great startup ideas, right? You see, if you hear the first time the Airbnb idea, hey, we have this idea and we're gonna let strangers sleep in your place, you're gonna be like, this is a crazy bullshit. This is never gonna take off, right? Why, But here's the thing about it, right? The moment you actually spend some time with it, you study a little bit kind of the data they had already collected, you see that this is actually a very good idea, which might actually work. But what it requires is to actually take time and look more deeply into the idea. And you can't do this if you have too many ideas. So only collect as many ideas if you have actually time to spend on and carefully select among those.
And it's also related to your filtering and judging process. So if you're looking at them all together, or if you're looking at in clusters, versus if you're looking at them in series. So there's a classic problem in economics that is called the secretary problem, or the wife problem. It has many different names. But what it means is that there are a pool of options for which you can only choose one. And when you've made your choice, that's it. You don't know who else was on the list, and you don't know. You only can decide at which point you're going to stop.
Aha, okay.
So if you're looking at them in series, for example, you're evaluating your options in series.
Yeah.
You have to decide: are you at the optimal stopping point, or are you going to throw the fish back and go fishing again?
Okay.
But this is often the way things come to us, for example, or it's just the way we're used to keep or reject.
We went from wife to fish there very quickly.
We did fishing, or secretary, or fishing, or
secretary.
It has many different names in different cultures. I think there's called the Maharajah's problem as well. It's a classic optimization.
Yeah, I really like this example because it's very relevant to even trading. If you want to buy a stock or sell a stock, do you know what's going to happen tomorrow? Is this the best point to enter, short or buy? Is this the best point to propose to the woman, or vice versa?
And it's the balance between taking in more information and making a judgment, or taking on more information and missing out. But that is also part of that filtering and selection process. Is you need to know what is your judging process going to be before you start evaluating your options. Otherwise, the default position is the secretary problem, which is a non-optimization.
Yeah. Well, there we go. Sarah Otner and Assistant Professor Henning Piezunka. It's been a pleasure having you two here. Fascinating conversation. And again, what I like, and I've mentioned this before the podcast, is the fact that you two are discussing each other's research, and we're here on the same table from different institutions. This is something I like to see. I'd love to encourage as well. And it's been absolutely fascinating. How can people, I guess, read more of your work, or I guess your most recent papers?
So the easiest way is probably to go on my website, henningpiezunka.com, where you find a copy of the paper. You also find a link to the other podcast you mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you also have a 2-minute video, which I took a look at. I think was it Stanford that you?
Yeah, true. Stanford has just written multiple articles on my work on crowdsourcing and has produced an absolutely fantastic video. Yeah, so
it's you walking around a stadium.
I'm still waiting to hear from the Academy Awards on that.
Nice. But make sure there's good judges on the panel there. And how can people, read your work or get in touch, Sarah?
So I'm also on saraotner.com. Okay. And the work that we've done together, we've been mentioning this special section of the Journal of Management Inquiry. It's open and free for the rest of the month, but also one thing that your listeners might not know is that academics have copies of our work that we can share. So if there's ever anything that you can't access or that isn't on our website, we have our authors' versions that we can share, and we are happy to share and discuss our work.
There we go. You heard it here first. Well, that's the podcast episode done. Thanks a lot for coming, Sarah and Henning. And thanks for listening or watching.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.